If I was to tell you that grass is blue, that pineapples sing in their sleep, and dinosaurs were spotted last week walking to Poundland, where everything still cost £1, how would you feel? Shocked, I imagine. And that's how I felt too, when a friend said to me that everyone deserves affection. After I finished explaining to him why I often found it uncomfortable to be a little spoon, to take in all the comfort and feeling of safety without giving anything back felt wrong. It was something I ultimately felt that I didn't deserve. The painting behind me is my favourite out of the paintings I have at home. Often when I paint, the finished piece isn't quite how I imagined it to be, but I think this time I managed to capture a feeling precisely, in the way that the frog's eyes are closed, and how they are leaning on nothing but each other. Less than a year before this painting was made, and with another person, I made what was called the 60-second rule, which over time expanded to the 90-second rule, and was essentially a boundary on how long I could handle being Little Spoon for before we needed to swap. Often in galleries, we see paintings of people in bed, and people holding each other, and I have often wondered how it would feel to paint one of these paintings. It didn't seem like something you could easily do without having some sort of personal experience of it. And it brought me great joy when that inspiration came, after years of painting what looked like colourful versions of the Scream. I was used to painting loneliness. I think this is where I need to mention that I've always felt different. For as long as I remember, I believed deeply and without a doubt that I wasn't as good as other people, although I could never pinpoint what good meant or how I lacked it. But it was a fundamental fact. It was the basis of how I understood the world and my place in it. I believed I didn't deserve the same as other people. I hope most people watching have never felt this, but the best way I can describe it is that I felt like a cookie without chips in a jar of chocolate chip cookies. And I didn't know what chocolate chips were at the time. I just knew I didn't have them. I guess to some extent, feeling different was to do with being foreign. But feeling different isn't the same as feeling inherently unworthy. And I know that in my time at Polish Scouts, I felt that I belonged, on a cultural level. It was the one space where it was no longer relevant that I didn't grow up with the same children's TV and snack foods as my school friends had. And it was no longer relevant that whenever we go back to Poland, I'm not in touch with the music charts and still have the same language skills as a 9-year-old. But at Polish Scouts, we were all in the same boat, except that I still felt like an outsider. I remember lying in the camp beds, awake at night and fantasizing about the conversation we would have if someone had accidentally noticed the cuts I put so much effort into hiding. I was desperate for someone to understand how I felt, at a time when I didn't really understand it myself, and I don't think I would have known how to explain it to them. We have been taught, by the people who find it too uncomfortable to sit with, that self-harm is a form of attention-seeking. But that's far from the truth. My brain hated itself, and when I couldn't put this discomfort into words, the only way I could get it out of my head was to carve it into my arms. The discomfort I remember is a feeling similar to being in a Zorba ball, or a hamster ball as some people like to call them, while the children around me were walking freely. The feeling of being trapped by my own brain, and watching them interact with each other in a way that seemed effortless. People often called me shy, and when language around mental health improved, they talked of social anxiety. But the truth is that in a lot of these situations, I wasn't anxious. I was lost. It wasn't that I wanted to say something and didn't have the confidence to get the words out. It was that I didn't know what those words would have been in the first place. In the summer between my 2 years at sixth form, I remember doing a Google search for how to make friends and how to talk to people. And for many years, this Google search was the most shameful secret I kept. But I guess it helped a little. Or maybe it was that I put more effort into observing how other people were interacting with each other. Moving away to university gave me the chance to create a new version of myself. A version that was going to be normal, and a version that was going to have friends. While at school, people were used to me being quiet, and it was difficult to suddenly start talking more. But at university, it felt almost natural. nearly all of us didn't know anyone, and from asking where someone had moved from to asking what they studied, it was never that hard to start a conversation. I put all my energy into fitting in, and knew better than to tell anyone that my favourite way to spend time was illustrating children's fairy tales, years after we were supposed to have stopped listening to them. I knew to never mention that I played with toys well into my teenage years, and this was another strange behaviour for which I felt so much shame. It was only when I saw Abby on Love on the Spectrum that I was able to forgive myself for this. So the first year of uni went well. I finally felt normal, and I made a group of friends strong enough that they all wanted us to share a house for second year. It was unfortunate that around this time my need to count calories was getting out of hand, and less than 2 months later I was at an eating disorders hospital where I stayed for the remainder of the academic year. By the time I returned to do second year again, I was about 10 months out of practice when it came to knowing how to have conversations with other students. I struggled especially with pre-drinks and felt like an outsider watching the rest of the group talking to each other. It was on one of those nights that the old feeling of being in a hamster's ball came back, and when we all went back to our rooms to get shoes and bags ready for the night out, I locked my door, took the blades out of a razor, and turned off the lights. It was weeks, maybe even months, before I could sit in my room without wearing sleeves. The sight of my own arms disturbed me so much, and I hated seeing them in the shower, but I couldn't stop myself from destroying them time and time again over the years. It was how I processed the persistent feeling that I wasn't as good as other people, the shame that came with it, and the hatred I felt towards myself. It helped me process feelings I didn't understand, and feelings which felt overwhelming. It helped me process feeling different. Life after uni got better, and once again I had the chance to create a new version of myself. It was more confident than before, and able to form stronger friendships with people. It opened up, and found more words. It came on staff nights out, and functioned almost like a normal person. It didn't quite as often. It worked in a busy pub kitchen, and sometimes during the lunchtime rush when the boss came upstairs to help us. It shut down from the pressure, staring blankly at the microwave in front of it, with not the faintest clue what to put inside it. A blank brain with no thoughts. I could only snap out of this when my kitchen friend shouted that it was peas. It was always peas in this memory, and once they had worked this out for me, I was then able to carry on with the rest. I sensed that thought stopping wasn't how everyone reacted to stress, but I didn't think much of it until summer last year, when I was telling this work story to a new friend. When I finished, she asked me if I'm autistic, and I said no, of course not. She told me that she has an autistic sister, and what I described sounds a lot like an autistic shutdown. I wasn't familiar with the phrase, and initially I chose not to believe it. I think partly I found it so hard to believe because I had wondered about autism before, as I tried to make sense of why I selectively didn't speak as a child. I was nervous to bring it up, but I shared my theory with a housemate at the time, who confidently told me that it cannot be autism. He did not provide an alternative explanation, but I knew better than to mention it to anyone again. Reluctantly, I began to research, turning to things like the DSM and the NHS websites, which provided vague explanations that I didn't know whether I fitted. At the time, I saw quite a lot of TikTok content from ADHD creators. Naturally, some of them also happened to be autistic. In the early days, I swiped past them as soon as the word autism came up, still ashamed from that time my old housemate told me with such confidence that I could not be autistic. But the little bits of the videos I'd seen were so relatable, and at the time I was just getting started at my first office job. Not only was this a big change, but it meant interacting with people in social settings that I had not interacted in before. I sensed that not all of my colleagues found it this difficult. While I recovered each day, in a dark room fully hidden under my duvet, I started to watch the autistic videos. 4 videos now, but always with my headphones in, a guilty secret. Always careful to make sure that my current housemate didn't notice. I didn't want to be seen as trying to belong to a group that I wasn't a part of. With time, TikTok learned to show me specifically videos from people who were women, who were late diagnosed, and who were high masking. Now, things started to make sense, and I went back to doing some real research. Everything from scientific articles to people's personal diagnosis stories and hours of in-depth YouTube content. I found better ways to understand the vague lists in the DSM and on the NHS website, and I learned to recognise that there were things I could do to help myself, like scheduling time alone before any big social interactions. After 3 months of working full-time, I was incredibly burnt out and in quite a bad place with my mental health. I went through a phase where I used to cry daily. It was mostly just from being so tired. This was the longest stretch of time that I'd ever done of full-time work, as my previous bar jobs have mostly involved shifts at weekends and occasional evenings. I used to have days free to myself, where I could spend as much time as I needed alone at home, making art or working on other creative projects. I always knew that I liked art, but I didn't fully appreciate until that point how essential it was to my well-being. I've never been good at expressing my feelings in words, but I found that I could always get them down visually, and once I had them in illustrations or paintings, I could explain what inspired each element of the artwork, and then the feelings made sense to me, and then I was able to explain them to other people. Being home also meant that I had the space to recover from the social interaction of being at work, and to spend time without feeling perceived, and without doing what I now understand is called masking. As I mentioned before, I'd had the deep understanding for many years that I was weird, and it wasn't something I was able to ever fully change about myself. To finally hear other people talk about brains which work in a similar way was life-changing. I was no longer the odd one out in a world full of average people. I just belonged to a smaller and more specific group. I want to add what a huge moment it had been when I first came across the use of the word perceived in the context of social interactions. I always used to stumble whilst trying to explain this feeling to people, and I didn't feel like they ever quite got what I meant. And now finally someone did, and not only did it make it easier to put into words how I felt, but it also massively legitimised my experience. But with the research and acceptance that I was finally able to give myself, also came the doubts, the imposter syndrome, and the deep fear that I made it all up. I admit that, now I'm in my 20s, on the surface I function quite well, and I've read lots of lists of traits, and of people's personal stories where their experiences and struggles are very different, or a lot more severe. On pretty much any given day, between when I started researching and today, I have flipped between whether I think I'm autistic or not. And as my understanding deepens and the evidence piles up, I begin to question not only whether or not I am autistic, but also my perceptions of words like hard and the relative severity of what I struggle with. To explain more simply, I think that I find change hard, for example, but now I wonder if I understand correctly what hard means, and whether the level of discomfort I experience around change could be the same that everyone else experiences around it. And when I return to thinking I'm not actually autistic, I have to find another explanation for many aspects of my life, for things I'm deeply embarrassed about, how awkward I was in high school, or running off to cry in situations which, to an outsider, would not have seemed that bad. If we assumed I was autistic, these could be explained as meltdowns, an easy word that many understand, and might have some idea how to respond to, a word that takes into account sensory overload, or an overwhelming amount of social pressure, and acknowledges that this is often a build-up of many factors, and that the little thing I reacted so strongly to is not the cause of the reaction. It is simply the tipping point of a brain which had stretched to its maximum capacity. But if we assumed I was not autistic, then the behaviour could be seen as pathetic, sad, weird, and childish. I want to thank the people who looked after me when this happened at work and gave the unconditional support when we didn't know why this kept happening. Liam and Ellie, I could not have done Deansgate without you. The last 10 months have been confusing, to say the least, and as I went through my research journey, I also started to open up to friends about the fact I think I might be autistic. While many people were supportive, accepting and understanding, some told me that they knew all along, and others shared that they were on a similar journey to try to understand themselves. It was the couple of conversations where my theory was met with upfront rejection that really stuck with me, causing havoc in my already confused head. To share took so much vulnerability and trust. To be told, in each instance so quickly, that I was wrong, made me feel a way I still haven't figured out how to put into words, but I guess empathetic people will be able to guess. On the NHS website, there is an article about signs of autism in adults, which includes a section called Autism in Women. To quote it directly, it says that autistic women may be more likely to have learned to hide the signs of autism to fit in by copying people who do not have autism, be quieter and hide their feelings, appear to cope better with social situations, show fewer signs of repetitive behaviours. This means it can be harder to tell you're autistic if you're a woman. I guess that explains a lot of it. I want to address here some of the reasons people have given me for why they do not believe I could be autistic. You're not autistic, you've worked in a bar. Part of what drew me to bar work was the opportunity to practice social interactions, because the more I practiced them, the easier they became. When the final lockdown came about, and we were weeks deep into it, I struggled to talk to people in my social bubble. There is a journal I have from this time which features a particular drawing of suicidal seals, where one of them has a thought bubble that says, "It was a bit awkward when they were there anyway." I remember making this drawing, while hiding upstairs from the social bubble who were in my living room, after I had felt too awkward and on edge to be around them. If this doesn't prove that I need regular practice of social interactions, then I don't know what will. And Bowick provided an opportunity for that practice. You're not autistic, you run workshops. Or we could say, you're not autistic, you make a script in your head about a set of games you understand, and then you say it out loud while knowing that at any given moment it is your turn to speak, since the job of a facilitator is to give out instructions. I want to add that in my time at university, I was very actively involved with the Drama Society. Naturally, I loved theatre as scripts gave me the words to say, and the chance to be a character meant I could escape from the experience of being myself, which ultimately I hated. Before we got on stage, we played drama warm-up games, the kind of games that are designed to make you look silly in front of people, and then we did projection exercises, that is the practice of getting sufficient volume into what you are trying to say. So with all of that behind me, I no longer fear speaking in front of groups. It is only when I don't know what to say that I struggle. You're not autistic, you're quite sociable. As though these two things can't be true at the same time. It took me a long time to learn how to make friends, and I cherish the ability to have successful social interactions. Lots of people like spending time with their friends. Why would it be inherently different for those who are autistic? I could talk for hours about the reasons why I think I might be autistic in relation to eye contact, a preference for planning some situations, a repetitive way of listening to music, the meltdowns and shutdowns, the burnout, the preference for certain textures, the times I have struggled with change, the reliance on planning what I'm going to say, my affinity with soft toys, the way I like tapping on things, and feel anxious if I leave the house without a hair bubble on my wrist, the way I play with those hair bubbles as I'm talking to people. But those are all reasons I could question. On the days I'm having the most doubts, I ask myself, or other people ask me, if they are to do with anxiety. But the one thing I do not question is that I have always felt like there was something wrong with me. I carry the evidence of that on my skin, and it is undeniable. I know that I will carry it on me forever. It was only when I started to understand what autism is that I started to understand that I was probably born predisposed to certain patterns of behaviour, and that I no longer had to punish myself for them. To learn this was a huge step, but to receive a diagnosis would mean I could forgive myself completely. I haven't spoken to many people about why I used to self-harm, and the reasons have shifted and grown over the years, some reasons not mentioned above, but at the bottom of each and every one of those reasons was the fact I fundamentally did not believe I was as good as other people, whatever good meant. And so, if you have seen my skin and do not ask me for the story, then I urge you to not give an opinion on what may or may not be diagnosable in my brain. At the time of writing, I am starting to take practical steps towards getting an assessment. I am keen to go private with someone who specialises in diagnosing high-masking adult women, and I know that undoubtedly the process will take some time and come with a lot of complicated emotions, further imposter syndrome and doubt. I was hoping to wait until I have the assessment before speaking about this so openly, but I am at a point where I can't catch up with friends without bringing up what the last 10 months have held, and to explain to each person when I don't know what their reaction will be is both terrifying and draining. I'm not looking for any particular response other than just to know that people have read this, so that I can talk about things like the assessment process without having to bring up the entire backstory every time. If you have made it this far, thank you.